Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar of the Asia-Scotland Institute. I'm Roddy Gow, the founder of the Institute, and we're really pleased that we've been able to assemble three outstanding experts to take a look now quickly at Syria after Assad. Is this a turning point for the Middle East? And to do that, we're delighted that we have John Wilks, who is with the Oxford Institute and was at one time the special advisor to Syria and the Syrian opposition, and he is in the Middle East. Vanda Felbab-Brown, who is a distinguished fellow at the Brookings Institute and has been following terrorism and other global movements for many years. And in London, Marco Vicenzino, who is a geopolitical expert and a frequent speaker as member of the Global Strategy Project. So without more ado, because you've got their details on the website, I'd like to ask John to help lead us off to see if we can see in this cloudy field some way forward. John, thank you.
Thank you, Roddy. Thank you for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm talking to you from Dubai, where everybody is talking about the latest developments as they are across the Middle East and Middle East watchers. And just to confirm that I was the UK's Syria envoy between 2012 and 2014, when we had shut our embassy in Damascus as the civil war spread. We were trying to get a political process underway. I finished that job with a very strong sense of unfinished business and have been following the tragedy of Syria. But I think I should say, in historic context, that we regarded what has happened now as one of the worst case scenarios, that the regime would fall very rapidly and what would begin to establish would be something that would turn into an Islamic State and would ideologically be very close to al-Qaeda. And so when I look forward, I tend to see negative scenarios. We're obviously in a period of high uncertainty, but I think the initial indications are that it is unlikely that we are going to see a pluralist process. The first signs are that the leadership of Ahmad Shara and Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which had been an al-Qaeda franchise until recently, in which I think ideologically remains very aligned, though with good media training and a lot of messaging designed to calm the region and the international community. I think we're going to face one of two scenarios, more likely scenarios. One is a consolidation of the power of this new HTS-led regime in Damascus, which is likely to face opposition from other parts of the country and therefore may well not be able to establish at an early stage governance across the whole of Syria. And that may actually then spread into friction, confrontations and conflict and a high level of chaos. I fear that the initial indications are not that we're going to move to a UN-led or overseen political process in which the different political forces will hammer out a new constitution. So I start from a position of pessimism, but many of these risks, I think, can be managed both by the neighbours of Syria and the international community. So there will have to be a lot of diplomacy to make sure that the risks, which are huge, are managed. I often say that the Middle East is a political earthquake zone, and in seminars that I've done since October the 7th last year, and the Israel-Gaza conflict, and more recently what's been happening in Lebanon, I've said these are earthquakes on known fault lines, maybe higher on the Richter scale to extend the metaphor. But we have had Israel-Lebanon wars, and we have had Israel-Gaza, Israel-Hamas conflicts before. But this, I think, the fall of the Assad regime and the establishment of some form of Islamic State in Syria, I think this is the big earthquake for the region. So this is not an aftershock, although clearly it was a consequence of what had been happening in the last year. And I think we will be watching aftershocks of this in Syria and in the neighborhood for some time to come. I won't, in my initial comments, because I know timing is tight, talk about the international dimensions. I know others will, and I'll come back to it maybe in Q&A. But I think we are seeing something akin to what we saw after the fall of Baghdad in 2003. I was there actually re-establishing the British embassy. Now, of course, in one sense, it's totally different. There is not a US-led occupation. There's not a foreign occupation. But the reactions of Syrians that I have picked up, both talking to those who have friends and family and colleagues on the ground, but also looking at the media, is very much a similar atmosphere to that of Iraq in 2003, a liberation effect to a certain extent, but deep anxiety and foreboding about what comes next. And what we saw in 2003 in Iraq is it took the different parts of Iraq, the different political and armed groups, a couple of weeks to really start to coalesce and to begin maneuvering, both politically and within conflict contexts. I'm imagining we're going to see the same thing happening. And so the tactic of HTS and Ahmad al-Shara will be to use the moderate messages to calm everybody, that we're in a transition, the old regime's handing over, we have an interim prime minister for 3 months. But in practice, what they'll be preparing for is to take on challenges. They won't necessarily want to control the whole country to begin with. They may indeed want to consolidate in Damascus and in Idlib and the areas around Aleppo first, and partner possibly with Turkey to contain the Kurds. I think the impression I get from people I've been talking to is that secular Sunnis, Christians, Alawites, Druze, other minorities, as well as the Kurds themselves, are very concerned, and there is across Syria a preparation for possible conflict to come. So I'm sorry to sound so gloomy. The message of hope, I think, is that the international community does have an ability, I think, to mitigate some of these risks. But I think the dynamics in Syria are heading towards a breakup and towards conflict. And therefore, I think we've got to think very seriously about the scenarios that we're facing and the actions that we can take to mitigate the risks involved. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. We will later on look at Russia's position in all of this, and Israel's and Turkey's, but thank you very much indeed for getting us going. Vanda, lovely to have your view from Washington. So we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you. John outlined pessimistic a picture. And indeed, in US government, the collapse of Assad had long been referred to as a catastrophic success, with the fear that either there would be emergence of a radical Islamist regime or another disintegration of the country in civil war. There is still a possibility, might not be a large possibility, that a reasonably pluralistic process could emerge that would stave off both scenarios, or at least the violence, the intense violence scenario. So in my view, there are really 3 core questions. The first one is, will there be any kind of stability in Syria, or are we going to see fall back into civil war? And if there is stability in Syria, what will be the nature of governance? The second is, what does this mean for Iran's axis of resistance, which clearly is decimated right now, but is it decimated forever? What factors would allow for it to be resurrected? And the third is what this means for Russia's projection of power outside of Europe, in the Middle East and across Africa. But let me, in my opening remarks, focus predominantly on the first, and perhaps later on in the conversation, we'll have time to think about the axis of resistance as well as Russia. So certainly the scenario that HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, will attempt to rule through a fairly authoritarian, if Islamist, mode is highly possible. This is indeed the way they've been ruling in Idlib. The Assad regime had been far more murderous and far more brutal than HTS rule, but HTS rule is an authoritarian jihadi rule. That said, we haven't seen mass slaughter of people. Yes, people are tortured, they're arrested if they protest, but we really haven't seen anything on the scale of what the Islamist regime could do, what ISIS used to do in Iraq, and what certainly the Assad regime could do. And since then, whether this is simply clever PR or not, the messaging has been consistently, we will protect minorities. That does not equate to we will give minorities a role in government, but we will protect minorities, we will not unleash slaughter against them. There's been consistent messaging, not just in the immediate weeks, but for several years to the West, that HTS has broken with Al-Qaeda and that it will oppose the Islamic State. And in fact, there has been fighting previously between HTS and the remnants of the Islamic State in Syria. So that messaging has continued. Finally, there's been some messaging that there is an effort to rule for all Syrians. Now, at the same time, what HTS has been doing is bringing people from Idlib who have been in governing positions in Idlib and installing them in various governing positions in Damascus. This is being pointed out as an indication that the messaging about the pluralistic rule is disingenuous. Perhaps it could be. I think that one needs to grant that it is crucial for anyone who is currently in control to make sure that chaos doesn't happen and that there is no paralysis. So one could be more generous and say the fact that bringing in administrators from Idlib does not inevitably have to be a proof that they are lying already. So, and they themselves that said they would stay in power until March, and by March there would be some sort of process, not necessarily elections, hardly possible to imagine elections in my view in the time frame, but there would be some sort of process to expand the rule to more pluralistic governance. So certainly in the absence of pluralistic governance, that in my view would need to include not just all ethnic and political minorities, but also the Baathists, not Assad's family, not the egregious actors in Assad's regime, but certainly in my view, it would be desirable to avoid the replication of the Baathification process that was so ruinous for Iraq. Out of that process, more legitimacy as well as accountability for the Syrian people could emerge. But it's also important to realize that even if these processes under UN auspices, under regional auspices get going, they would be difficult, painful, and there are many potential spoilers. And they might not emerge. It might simply be that we will see fairly rapid coalescence of a authoritarian HTS rule. So if we see that happening, or even if we don't see that happening, another core question is how will HTS manage its relationship with the other armed actors? Every group, every minority group is armed, including the Alawites. And certainly the partners for HTS in toppling the regime, the Syrian National Army, are not just armed, but they're ready, they've been part of the fight, and they want serious stakes. They are, in my view, as unpredictable and dangerous actor as HTS, and could very much be a cause of both great violence as well as great problematic domestic and international behavior. And we need to realize that while Ankara has substantial sway over SNA, SNA is a far more amorphous collection of actors than HTS, many of whom are outright criminal actors. They are not wrapped in the same ideology, jihadi ideology, but they are not actors about whom we should not be concerned. We should be very concerned about SNA. So will just that basic balance stay, or are we going to see in a matter of time fighting between SNA and HTS that inevitably would then pull other actors in? The second, or the third factor is, of course, what will external actors do? United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Israel have all made the judgments several months, years ago, that living with Assad was better than living with an Islamist governance. Certainly for UAE and Saudi Arabia, the threat of jihadists is behind every rock and corner. And they were caught out in the toppling of the regime, as everyone else did. But it's very possible that as time proceeds, they would start instigating efforts through armed means or otherwise to bring an HTS regime down. And that could then set off either fighting or other kind of difficulties, but it's very difficult to see how simply bringing down an HTS regime would bring in a stable replacement. And so the external environment might be as much a source of the country exploding into violence as the internal dynamics. I should also say that at some point, if HTS is in rule, whether pluralistic or authoritarian sole rule, it will need to be dealing with the Islamic State and potentially other actors, not just the old Islamic State in the Middle East, but new offshoots like the Islamic State in Khorasan, whether it fights them or it accommodates them, whether it delivers to the West and to the Arab countries of trying to suppress them. Those will be definite violent clashes and violent challenges coming down the road. And my final comment before handing it over to Marco is, of course, there is the issue of the destroyed Syrian economy, which is not just a problem of catastrophic humanitarian consequences with people enormously suffering, and all the more people suffering as many refugees, Syrian refugees, are trying to get home to see their family. They are enormously joyous of the Assad regime being toppled. We need to recognize of how much there is excitement and joy and happiness about the murderous regime having come down. So, but people are coming back. The economy is in catastrophic states. The Captagon trade that has kept the Assad regime going is disrupted, but it's hardly over. It will continue, and the ruling entities will need to decide how they want to deal with it. They're saying they'll suppress it. That will come with real costs, but new actors will move to take it over. And then there is, of course, the issue of economic assistance from outside, with the sanctions on HTS stemming from its terrorist designation, preventing direct engagements with HTS. There are, it's certainly direct economic injection of resources going to HTS. There are workarounds. The prime example of the workarounds is Afghanistan and the Taliban. But those workarounds are enormously clumsy, enormously difficult, and really just keeping a plaster on a catastrophic economic situation in Afghanistan. But the resolution of will the designation of terrorism be removed from HTS or not will be crucial for what happens with an economic reconstruction, and that in turn will be crucial for whether there is stability in some form or disintegration into fighting.
Vanda, thank you very much indeed for your comments. It still looks even more complex than when John had left it, and not many grounds probably for optimism. But I'm delighted that Marco, who's a member of our International Advisory Council at the Age of Scotland Institute, will now be able to give us some perspective on what the surrounding countries have been doing. Nature abhors a vacuum, and it looks as if Israel certainly and others are moving in to take advantage of the situation. Marco.
Okay, thank you. So, no, although the external powers, they're going to seek to get influence in Syria and during the transition. Ultimately, I think they'll be initially reduced to a wait-and-see role as the political process unfolds. For now, it'll likely be primarily driven by Syrians, with HTS in the lead. And other factions were going to aggressively, they're going to jockey for their share of power, hoping that HTS and like-minded groups, they're going to curb their Islamist tendencies for the sake of the greater collective good. And while such groups will proceed with utmost caution during that process in their dealings with HTS, as the skeptics, we're going to dismiss that as wishful thinking. All right. So in terms of Assad's downfall, it marks a clear humiliation and devastating strategic blow for both Russia and Iran in the Middle East and beyond. Iran loses its land bridge that extends from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. It's often referred to as the Shiite Crescent. However, Iran still retains formidable allies and loyal proxies in Iraq. In Yemen, it still has the Houthis that continue to destabilize international trade and disrupt global commerce and shipping lanes in the Red Sea and also in the Horn of Africa. With respect to Russia specifically, so Russia, like Iran, faces a major strategic reversal with the likely loss of its only overseas port and airbase in Syria. These ports and this airbase would project Russian influence in the Middle East and the Mediterranean Sea, and also served as a conduit into Russian operations in Africa. Russian vessels and warplanes have already departed from what we see so far. Any other plans to relocate those Russian operations in Libya or Sudan as substitute bases at present is not feasible because they lack the infrastructure of the air base and the naval port in Syria. That's for the Russians. In terms of Turkey, overall, I would say Turkey has the most to lose from an unstable Syria. Listen, for over 13 years, the Turks have invested heavily in what is now the winning side, what appears to be the winning side in the Syrian civil war. However, it still remains unclear whether Turkey's investment will pay off. If Syria's opposition forces turn on each other, Turkey remains most vulnerable. It was going to be most vulnerable possibly to another wave of Syrian refugees, and it'll increase its challenges from the Kurdish militants on both sides of the border. In terms of European capitals, they're currently struggling with the continuing fallout of the Ukraine war, mass migration, internal political polarization, lackluster leadership, and the return of a determined second Trump administration. So fears of spillover into Europe from Assad's downfall further complicates an already brewing powder keg. Memories of the Middle East refugees flooding Europe back nearly a decade ago and its political fallout still torments the European capitals. By that I mean is sort of the rise of populist parties, et cetera, et cetera. We know what's happening in European politics today. So if we look at the Gulf states briefly, the Gulf states embarked on a rapprochement with Assad months ago. His downfall triggers mixed reactions. The rise of the Islamists is traditionally seen as a perennial existential threat for the monarchies, specifically in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. However, in my opinion, geopolitical necessity and new regional realities will force them to directly engage with any new government that comes up in Syria sooner rather than later. In terms of Qatar, with its traditional pro-Islamist sympathies, Qatar has previously supplied Syrian opposition factions going back years. It's going to continue to expand and grow and expand its regular policy of outreach, playing all sides to a strategic advantage as critical interlocutors. In addition to that, they have a lot of money to back that up. In terms of Israel, now listen, although Israel didn't, the seeds of Assad's downfall were planted years ago. Israeli attacks in both Lebanon and Syria in recent months against both Hezbollah and pro-Iran forces in Syria basically served as a critical catalyst in accelerating the regime's demise. But as Damascus was falling to the opposition, Israeli forces were already occupying the buffer zone that separates Israel with Syria. and they begin bombing chemical stockpiles and a lot of the military infrastructure to ensure that HTS and other groups don't inherit that military infrastructure to their advantage and to the disadvantage of Israel. So for Israel, Assad, for years, you can call him a fairly convenient and predictable opponent. However, in a rapidly changing Middle East, Israel cannot afford any form of complacency. The fresh memories of October 7th serve as a constant reminder. As far as the U.S. is concerned, it still maintains its 900 troops in two enclaves in eastern Syria. But primarily, in all these years, the U.S. focus has been primarily on preventing the spread of post-ISIS jihadist activities. But however, in a post-Assad Syria, in my opinion, the U.S. is going to have to skillfully navigate a more complex environment in the region beyond simple military operations. The new incoming Trump administration, in my opinion, is going to have to do a deep rethink on embarking on a new U.S. Middle East policy, once again, to adapt those new realities. Jordan remains directly exposed to events in Syria, obviously has a long border with Syria, but as a close U.S. ally, it plays a critical role in supporting the U.S. in eastern Syria. So it has that part of the protective umbrella. Listen, throughout Iran, throughout the civil war, Iran has played a key part in the Assad regime. Now with its downfall, Iraq, the Iraqi forces, from a commercial perspective, they're going to lose that arms trade as part of that Shiite crescent. And then also, there's also subject to instability, instability in Sunni majority areas in Iraq, like Anbar province, and places like Kirkuk, which has, oil-rich Kurdish majority city. They may experience a degree of instability there as part of an overflow, sort of a blowback from what's happening in Syria. In terms of Iranian influence, Iranian influence permeates every part of Iraqi society. However, the loss of credibility and regime that Iran is suffering, that's going to adversely impact its longer-term influence in Iraq and potentially other quarters throughout the region. And finally, in conclusion, you can see in recent decades, there's been several new dawns in the Middle East. Most have degenerated into long-term called dusks. Now, with the fall of the Assad regime, there is another historic opportunity to alter course. It was going to take exceptional, but not impossible, act from regional players and from Syrian leadership. It's going to require a certain degree of collective will in Syria and the region, enlightened leadership in Syria and the broader region, and it's going to require public support to defy historic precedent. The bottom line is that historic precedent favors the skeptics.
Marco, thank you very much. Let's open this up for a sort of conversation amongst the panel. John, can you react and comment on what Marco has said and how that adds to your own view?
Yeah, maybe I'll come on to some of the international points that Marco and Wanda both raised. In the conversations I've been having today with a lot of Middle East watchers, people have been asking, who's up and who's down among the neighbouring countries, the regional powers, the international powers. Because I tend to be pessimistic about the likely scenarios, I think it's actually very difficult to see any great upside for anybody. With Marco on Turkey, there are some upsides, but Turkey's going to have to manage the areas of Syria bordering on Turkey. It's not just about the Kurds. It is about overspill of further refugees, terrorism. The economic situation, as Werner pointed out, is dire across Syria. The one country probably that you could say is going to benefit from what's happened is Qatar. My last job was British ambassador to Qatar, and the Qataris have, like the Turks, got good relationships with a lot of the Islamist opposition forces, and they will no doubt already be attempting to act as go-between between HTS and others and regional and international powers. I think for the US and Israel, this is going to be a very difficult set of scenarios to manage. I was talking at a conference about 3 weeks ago up in Iraqi Kurdistan with some of the officials that were in the first Trump administration working on the Middle East and are likely to go back in. So that was before the latest developments. And one of the themes of our discussion was how complicated it was going to be to decide what to do about the US military presence in Syria and what remains of Islamic State. And I think maybe I'll finish by just bringing that point out a little bit. There are 50,000 radicalized Islamic State elements in the camps and prisons of central Syria. The US military and coalition military presence and the presence of other military forces, including the Turks, has in part been to contain the threat of Islamic State. It seems from the history that's got us here that it could well be that an HTS regime established in Damascus, a little like the Taliban regime in Kabul, could be a counterterrorism partner in some respects against Islamic State. But if we have the scenario where there is a spread of conflict and only limited and patchy governance across Syria, there must be the possibility that there are mass breakouts from these detention centers, and we have Islamic State coming back onto the scene. And then, if I could just mention one other thing, I think there is great concern in Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon, the neighboring countries who could be very seriously destabilized by any of these more negative scenarios. And I know a lot of the diplomacy, particularly for Western countries, US, UK, European countries, will be about shoring up particularly Jordan and Lebanon, but also trying to work with Iraq as well to make sure that we don't have a return to widespread conflicts there. And it's something I reflect on with my Syria and Iraq experience I'll finish off with, which is Iraq tended to implode in on itself after 2003, whereas Syria tended to explode out into its neighborhood. We could analyze why this has been the case, but it is in part around geopolitics and the nature of the relationship of these countries with their neighbors. But I think all the neighbors are extremely concerned about that potential for what goes on in Syria now to spill out again, as it did after 2011. Thank you.
John, would the common threat result in some sort of unifying force on the neighbours?
So I think all the neighbours and indeed the big international players will be thinking about, what are the interests that we could build a relationship with some form of an Islamic regime developing in Damascus. And I think we've sort of covered the ground that is in the minds of the leaders of these countries, and that would include counterterrorism work against Islamic State. It would, of course, include the return of refugees and ongoing humanitarian aid, the containment and reduction of the drugs trade, the captagon trade, and to an extent, I think, going beyond humanitarian aid to some form of economic reconstruction, because as Vanna pointed out, Syria is in a terrible financial state. It does not have great oil resources as Iraq has. It was always assumed, and Russia always said, it would not fund reconstruction, that it would be the Gulf and Western donors. But I'm not sure, even with the more moderate messaging that's coming out, whether Syria, under an HTS-led government in Damascus, is going to be able to present itself to international donors as a great partner for development aid and reconstruction.
Thanks, John. Vanda, can we turn to you now for your comments, and then after that I'm going to come to Marco again.
Yeah, well, maybe a few things. So there are many comparisons currently being made between HTS and the Taliban, many of which are quite simplistic, if not altogether facile. But with the risk of erring in the same way, I'll make one comparison. When the Taliban came to power, regional actors, Russia, China, India, Iran, and of course, Central Asian countries had to decide whether they would try to subvert the Taliban regime like they did in the 1990s or accommodate and live with it. The Taliban, just like HTS today, had of course been promising that it would prevent the flow of terrorist activities outside of Afghanistan, that Afghanistan would not become a bastion of terrorist attacks elsewhere. And just like in Syria, there is the Islamic State, a mortal enemy of the Taliban, with the Taliban intensely fighting Islamic State in Khorasan, but hardly being able to eliminate it or altogether contain it. And the region there made the decision that it was far better to be living with the brutal, exclusionary, women, apartheid-inducing Taliban regime. And we have seen many significant rapprochements from across the region, certainly from Russia, which is just moving to remove the Taliban from its list of banned terrorist countries. China, that was the first country to accept the accreditation of the Taliban ambassador, but also rather close relations between India and the Taliban, including quite significant trade between Afghanistan and India. And so this is, one scenario that as much as the regimes in the Gulf, the Emiratis and the Saudis really have predominantly focused on suppressing any kind of jihadist governance anywhere, that the calculus might be that stability, even under the auspices of a jihadist regime, is better than disintegration into civil war and the flows of refugees and the unpredictability of environment this would cause with respect to terrorism. Now, of course, if HTS were to start hosting terrorist safe havens, gave some sort of carte blanche to either the Middle East version of ISIS or ISKP or others, that might change the calculus. The second factor I want to reflect on a bit is the axis of resistance. Marco got into it. Certainly Hezbollah, the jewel crown in the axis of resistance, has been catastrophically weakened from the perspective of Tehran and certainly from the perspective of Hezbollah. But I would not assume that they are forever finished. And what kind of governance emerges in Lebanon? Is the national governance going to be able to be far more effective and efficient than it has been? Is it going to be able to provide for Shia people in Lebanon? Are we going to see reconstructions in the areas destroyed by Israel's bombing? All will be big factors of how fast and how Hezbollah is resurrected, even without significant reconstruction efforts of Hezbollah by Tehran. And incidentally, Hezbollah, just like the Iraqi pro-Iranian groups, are major vectors and actors in Captagon's smuggling. So Captagon production will move out of the hands of Assad and his brother to someone else's hands, but there are very many actors in the network that benefit from trafficking, and both groups like Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq and Hezbollah in Lebanon are prime examples. I would also say that the Houthis that are often thought of as the spare in the axis of resistance, the second prince to Hezbollah, are actually far more resilient, and I would also posit far more independent of Tehran. Yes, they have greatly benefited from Tehran's support, from the transfer of missiles. They are anti-Western. They are increasingly deeply involved in al-Shabaab in Somalia, something of great concern. But they also have far more space for maneuver and independence. Not necessarily for the good, but I don't think we should think of them as simply a Tehran puppet and assume that that will be a domino to fall in the same way that we have seen with Hezbollah. And the big question is what will happen with the pro-Iranian groups in Iraq. They are deeply permeated into institutions. They control security institutions, justice institutions. They are closely associated with political parties, have been actors of repression in Iraq, and have a lot of official political power and official institutional power. But are we going to see any repercussions from the collapse of the axis of resistance, from the weakness of Tehran, from the way it's not been able to prop up any of its core proxies anywhere? Are we going to see some sort of ability in the Iraqi political system to start significantly weakening the pro-Iranian Hashd al-Shaabi? Or are we going to see Tehran doubling down on preserving this asset to the last possible investment? And finally, I have thoughts on Russia, but let me hand it over to Marco, and maybe we can come to Russia later.
Thank you, Vanda. Marco, lots to reflect on.
Yes, I mean, listen, in terms of Lebanon, it's an historic opportunity for the Lebanese to make an attempt to try to create a more functional state and diminish as much as possible, but never fully possible, foreign interference. So it's for the Lebanese themselves, obviously many factions, many sects. It's an opportunity for them to try to build some form of a more functional state that they've been lacking for a long time. The economy is shattered, and so it gives them an opportunity also maybe to revive with external help, of course, but that ultimately is going to be determined upon the ability of Lebanese to come together, and only they can decide. If they make progress internally, politically, that can incentivize external forces to give more resources. And the Lebanese are also hoping that the many over 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon would go home. But the question is not just in Lebanon, but the Syrian refugees. Remember, when the war was started, there was roughly a population in the 20-25 million range estimated. A bit over half of that population, over 12 million, left Syria. They're in different countries, most of the majority obviously being in Turkey, surrounding countries, Lebanon, Jordanians have taken them in. Europe has taken an enormous amount of them also. But the question is are these refugees, when they say they're going to go home, the question is, what are they going to go home to? Many of the villages and the places where they come from are completely decimated and destroyed. There's lack of resources to rebuild it, these places where they come from, where they live in. So what incentive do they have to go home? In addition, the question is what infrastructure is there if they do go home? And the other question is, what kind of government are they going home to? Are they going to go back and make an attempt to go home and then live under what we've been referring to here as some form of extremist regime? If that person is sitting in a camp in Turkey or is sitting in Syria or somewhere in Europe, they may not be in the best of conditions, but at least they have the basics. So many would prefer to have the basics than to go back to the unknown. And then also I would say with respect to, if you're looking at the reconstruction costs, everyone's looking to the Gulf countries. Many are looking to the Europeans, to a certain extent, the Americans, but less so, particularly if you're looking with the Trump administration. But the issue is, who are your partners on the ground? So before any money starts coming in, there has to be at least a minimum degree of clarity as to how the political situation is evolving. Who are going to be your partners on the ground? That will take time. And as long as that takes time, any money coming into the country will also take time, probably an extended period of time. So we're looking in terms of this, and it's just not Syria. I mean, if we look at places that need to be reconstructed because of conflict, Syria, yes, we know it's been nearly 13 years since the civil war started, but you also have many parts of Lebanon. So you have parts of Lebanon that have been decimated by the conflict with Israel in recent months. And then also you have Gaza. We've not discussed Gaza in this entire webinar, but the situation in Gaza is desperate. The question is, how is Gaza going to be rebuilt? If, how, when, and many, many questions. Is that money going to come from the Turks? Is it going to come from the Gulf Arabs? Yes, they do have a lot of money in the Gulf, and the Turks have their challenges, but they do have resources. And where are they going to build first, and how much resources will they dedicate to each one of these three specific areas? What serves their interests best to serve? Obviously, many would look at Syria, because Syria is the one that's going to be its borders, several countries, borders Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, part of Israel, Iraq. So for many in the region, the main focus is likely to be Syria for at least for the foreseeable future. Lebanon, if the political leadership, if they can come together politically, it'll incentivize others, particularly the Europeans and the French. But Gaza remains a big question mark because of the situation.
Marco, do you see Russia trying to get out of the situation? Trying to withdraw?
Will attempt its best to try to retain whatever they could, if they can retain, try to cut some kind of deal, offering resources, whatever is needed, because those ports and that airbase are extremely important to them. But I think for the most part, I think the Russians are realistic that the likelihood of that is not very high. And in particular, you see many people that have taken Damascus, HTS, and their other affiliated groups, for them to cut a deal with the country that decimated many of their people would be politically very difficult when it comes to their base, their political base, those who are supporting them. So I would say those at the top, yes. I mean, usually those in political leadership tend to be a bit more pragmatic at times. But the issue is you also have to satisfy your base. And if they look at, there'll be major consequences if they cut some kind of deal with the Russians. There'll be a reaction and blowback from their base and from many ordinary Syrians.
Okay, thanks. Since you are in the United States, Vanda, what role do we think the United States is inclined to play? And to what extent under a Trump administration will it try to keep out of it?
Well, President-elect Trump tweeted in bold capital letters that the U.S. should stay out of Syria, that it has no stakes and interest in the country. But of course, it's not correct. The United States has many interests, not the least of which is terrorism and the presence of U.S. Special Operations Forces that have been at the core of fighting the Islamic State. But it's also clear that the Trump administration will be predominantly focused on other issues. And across the Biden and Trump administration, the prior Trump administration, there has been a desire to limit very dramatically U.S. involvement in internal stabilization issues and get out of it. The Biden administration's strategy was no more global war on terrorism and great power competition with China and Russia, something that will, at its core, stay with the Trump administration, at least with respect to China. I'll be eager to see how the relationship with Russia will evolve given Trump's and Putin's closeness and relationship. Let me say what I don't think the United States should do. I think that the United States certainly will not be putting in significant military resources, and it might well be that the Trump administration pulls U.S. Special Operations Forces out of Syria, which would weaken further possibility to temper any resurgence of the Islamic State. But even if that happens, the U.S. should remain involved in trying to shape governance that is stable and as accountable and pluralistic as possible, and to be helping the region to foster that kind of relationship or to be mitigating threats that come out of spillovers, negative spillovers of Syria. So completely disengaging would be a very unwise US policy. But let me make one comment about Russia that I think is important. Look, John had said it's hard to say who is up because the scenarios are likely pessimistic and everyone in some ways is down. Well, there is hardly an actor that is more down than Russia. Russia is just exposed in the hollowness of its commitments, in the utter inability to protect and prop up the Assad regime, the effort that Russia mounted on behalf of Assad was pathetic. Essentially, Russian military advisors just pulled back and ran away. You had few bombings. Now, that's good because Russia has been as brutal and murderous as the Assad regime, and some of the worst and most egregious killings in the prior iteration of the war, like the bombing of Aleppo, were at the hands of Russia. So I'm pleased that Russia was so humiliated and just essentially ran away. But this, I think, needs to be noted and is being noted across Africa, where Africa Corps now officially and explicitly under the Russian government is promising juntas and regimes in West Africa, in Central Africa, on the Atlantic coast, that it will not only protect them from jihadists, but it will also be their Praetorian Guard. Caveat emptor, you should see how unreliable and ineffective Russia is in doing so. Russia had already had grave setbacks in Mali this summer, and this is yet a really significant aspect of it. And if Russia loses Tartar and Hamamin, the naval base and the air base, that has real significant implication for its logistical ability to be supplying Africa Corps deployments across the Sahel and elsewhere in Africa. It's not their only logistical asset. Russia has similar logistical assets in Libya. But if HTS does tell Russia to pack up and leave Tartus and leave Hamamin, that will really hamper their resupply ability and their power projection, not just in the Middle East, but also in Africa. And finally, Moscow is reaching out to HTS, has changed language about HTS. It's clearly desperate to preserve access to the bases. But apart from the political repercussions with respect to the base that Marco talked about, for HTS to accept Russia's presence would be to accept the Trojan horse. Russia could just not be trusted in any way not to at some point join some sort of fight on behalf of another actor.
One of the comments that's been made in the Q&A from people who've been observing and listening to this webinar is that, is there or is there not a rumor that the Syrian regime is having almost made agreement with Putin to keep Russian bases? What you said, that appears to be extremely unlikely. And another question is, what if the Middle East and Gulf states unite without the West? John, is there any possibility of that happening, do you think?
To support the HTS regime in Damascus? Is that the
I guess the
question?
To deal with it.
Yes. So on the first question, it's sort of implicit in what we've been saying about the Russian bases. I don't see how they keep them. Satellite imagery shows that the ships have been moved out of the port into the Mediterranean and the planes have been withdrawn, primarily for force protection reasons, because obviously there is no or disputed governance in those areas. But if you have the HTS regime consolidating itself, as we've heard, very difficult to do some sort of strategic deal to allow them back and to protect them, given they've been bombing and destroying people and infrastructure for so long. And that is the base that the new regime in Damascus will rely on. And then if it is chaos, again, you're not going to get the force protection. So I sort of feel I'm willing to make the prediction that that's finished for Russia to have those bases. But then on this question of, so we are where we are. Should we engage? Should the Gulf engage? Should the West engage? I do think that given we've had the moderate messaging, given we've had a commitment to protect minorities and to avoid chaos, I think actually we do, for the time being, have to engage, all of us, West, Arab world, Russia, Iran, and to test these things out, to go in without any illusions, to understand the huge downsides that we're dealing with, but to explore the true nature, judging by actions, not words, of the emerging forces, and to explore if these moderate messages are borne out by the actions to protect citizens, to protect minorities, to work out whether we have common interests, for instance, in counterterrorism activity against Islamic State. But given that the scenarios that are most likely, I think we've got consensus in the webinar, are going to be the darker scenarios. I think we have to, certainly Western countries, have to prop up Jordan and Lebanon. I think we are going to see a very difficult relationship between the Sunnis of Syria and the Sunnis of Iraq and Jordan and Lebanon going forward. And to finish off, I'll maybe just mention a few anecdotes when I was Syria envoy. I didn't go into Syria when I was doing that job, although I visited Syria beforehand. And I knew and met outside of Syria in the region in Europe, secular Sunnis, Christians, the middle classes, basically, who would always say, whatever the criticisms you, Britain, I was representing at the time, have about this regime, you have to realize the alternative is not a beautiful pluralist democracy. It will be an Islamic State, and therefore we're not on your side in supporting the opposition and trying to get a political process going. And I just wonder what those people, are we going to see a refugee flow? Some may go back, the rural Sunni proletariat may go back from Turkey and from Lebanon, but are we going to see an exodus of the middle classes, including secular Sunnis? And then the second thing is a young American-educated Syrian who was a member of the opposition, who was working, with Syrians across sectarian, ethnic, regional divides, trying to build the democratic alternative that we hoped would lead to a political process and a political transition, said to me, "John, never underestimate for us," and I think he meant young Syrians, the power of the idea of the restoration of legitimate Islamic rule out of Damascus as one of the great capitals and early imperial capitals of the Arab Islamic Empire. And I just wonder whether, just as the Palestine issue always has huge emotive resonance across the world, particularly in the Arab and Islamic world, so I think we have to reckon with the fact that, an Al-Qaeda ideology, whatever the moderate messaging, and let's hope some of that moderate messaging is proven true, is now at the heart of the Middle East, the heart of the Arab world. We are not now talking about living in caves in Afghanistan or in the Sahel. I think this is going to have huge resonance and impact under whichever scenario unfolds, and will probably mark a turning point for the Middle East, but not for the better.
John, thank you. Well, we have to start to wrap this thing up now quickly. So closing thoughts, 30 seconds or so from Marco.
Yes, I guess I'll just, re-emphasize, we've had these historic opportunities in recent years. New dawns have become, dusks. Many of them, most have not actually gone well. The historical precedent favors the skeptics. Let's call them the pessimists, perhaps. Or some even refer to them as realists in light of the experiences of the recent past. But one has to be open also to the fact is, a bit of flexibility in mind is to, this is an occasion, certain factions, certain individuals, certain leaders, maybe elements of the population may rise to the occasion. It seems unlikely at this point. So one is not being pessimistic or optimistic, but it's important just to be realistic. And to be a realist in this situation, sober realism is what's required above all. But I think most states in the region and beyond do have a common interest. I mean, everyone has different interests, but they do have a common interest in preserving some form of stability in Syria, because the consequences of spillover, of fragmentation internally, and spill over regionally and beyond. And the consequences, everyone will pay a price.
Thanks, Marco. And Vanda, any closing thoughts on your part?
Yes, let me echo that sentiment. Clearly, policymakers need to prepare for the bad outcomes, collapse, civil war, and mitigating spillovers. But we should also not assume that it is the only inevitable outcome. As John said, there is an opportunity and need to engage with HTS to test whether there is any recognition and learning on its part, that it could govern in a way that's acceptable. Could it govern in a way that's better than the Taliban rule in Afghanistan, and certainly far better than ISIS? That would, in the best of scenarios, be pluralistic and include different facets of Syria society, minorities, political groups, civil society, or at minimum is not as vicious, brutal, and detrimental as the Assad regime, nor does it foster Islamist jihadism. If we assume right now that they are not going to be able to do that, that will be the worst possible rule, then we will cement the worst possible rule and have to deal with the only outcome of being all the bad spillovers that we are afraid of, and all the terror for the Syrian people that we are afraid of.
Vanda, thank you. I want to thank all of you, because we pulled this webinar together at about 48 hours notice. So you were splendidly responsive. And I know that those listening have benefited enormously from your shared and combined wisdom from different angles. This is our last meeting of the year. So we hope as we look at 2025 that things are going to be brighter. They don't look particularly so at the moment, but let's wish each other all of the happy holidays and Christmas and a very happy and fruitful New Year, or as we say in Scotland, happy Hogmanay to you all. And once again, thanks so much for participating on behalf of the Asian Scotland Institute. Thank you.